Hello, everyone. This is a lecture video for SPED 225X, week 4, Who are students with disabilities, part 2. In part 1, I had you all look at a video or watch a video where we explain the different types of special education categories that a student with a disability might fit in under. In this week, we're going to be focusing on identifying students who would fit in under those categories. Some of our guiding questions: how are students identified, and what role does IDEA play in educational rights of children with disabilities? For the activity, we've changed it up a little bit, and I'll explain that towards the end of the video. We'll just go ahead and get right into it. First, we're going to be looking at some core components of IDEA that are pertinent to identifying students with disabilities, or SWD, as that acronym shows. We're going to look at FAPE, zero reject, child find, evaluation, and eligibility. So for FAPE, or free appropriate public education, I am fairly certain that I've talked to you all about FAPE in a number of ways, or kind of just keep bringing it up, and I will continue to bring it up because, as you will come to find as well, nearly everything comes down to FAPE in special education. And the reason for that is that any child with a disability is is served under IDEA is entitled to that FAPE. Any child. And by that, this is where all the other laws come from and all the other rules that we have to follow. It really starts with that FAPE. It's the tippity top line that we have to pay attention to. There are lots of reasons why we could say it's considered a bedrock of IDEA or special education, whichever way you like to look at it. The first, if we're looking at just the law, it is the first line in why we have that law to begin with. It is a huge guiding principle for special education. And you have to think a little bit more historically as to why that would be. There was a time, and that time was not long ago, where there was no special education, or where, maybe a little bit further into the future, but not long ago either, special education was not great. It was not effective. I think those are still questions you could ask today, but we have definitely known that we have improved as a field exponentially and probably over a short period of time. And a lot of it is because we can say, well, the children are entitled to that free, appropriate public education. And when we break those words down, we can ask the question of what aspects of FAPE would be the most difficult to evaluate. So free and public, nobody really argues about what that means. Free school, public school, we understand that. But appropriate, that is the word. Like appropriate education, if you think of them together, those are the ones where it gets really, really difficult. Because what is appropriate? Because what is appropriate to me, it may not at all be what is appropriate at minimum by the law. It may not be at all appropriate by the other educators in the building. And this is a huge, or also by parents and by the child themselves. This is like the big essential question that happens. And as I know I've mentioned before, special education is a very litigious field in education. And so many of the litigation cases that happen or appear are citing FAPE as a reason for, or a student not receiving their entitled FAPE as a reason for a lawsuit. And so it's very important that we understand that, but also understand that it's a difficult thing to effectively and definitively prove sometimes. So who is covered under FAPE? I'm sorry, I should mention the notes, or the PowerPoint for today is generally built for like an in-class session. And so you'll see these empty spots that like are fill in the blanks. I do them when I do like a guided notes example with students. I'm going to read out the answers, but for those who are curious, let me spread this out a little bit. If you look at the PowerPoint slide at the bottom of the slides, those first couple words there will also be the fill in the blank words. I just wanted to make that known, but also a little way for you to look at how you could do guided notes with students as well. Okay, FAPE, who is covered? Individuals identified with a disability are deemed eligible for special education and related services. It's kind of at its most base. Because we have an identified student with a disability, and because there's a law that tells us we have to do something about that, then that student is eligible for special education and all of those related services, however needed. It doesn't mean that just because there are so many related services that the student's going to get all of them. It's based on their individual need. In addition to this, our students who are identified under Section 504 of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are also entitled to FAPE. There is a huge misunderstanding, and I'm also a part of that group, because the ADA laws related to education are not as fleshed out as one would say IDEA is. For the most part, ADA focuses on making places accessible, whether that mean physically or environment or through like affirmative action type work. But then under that ADA law, we have Section 504, which says that an individual with a disability in any education setting must be provided their most appropriate accommodation, I believe. The reason it gets fairly messed up is because although students under Section 504 are allotted that same free appropriate public education, meaning that teachers cannot deny them that accommodation because it's been determined that they need that accommodation to be able to learn in the classroom or to function and work and be in the school or be in their setting, that it gets into this like weird little point where that individual's disability may not be so impactful that it is hindering them academically or behaviorally. However, that disability still has an impact, and that impact can be mitigated or supported through however many accommodations. And then the student will just function very well within those accommodations without the need of a teacher, without the need of being pulled out of class or having somebody push in. It's more just being able to provide those specific accommodations that individual needs. It gets really hairy. If you have a student who's eligible under Section 504 and their disability is actually affecting their academic progress with those accommodations, then my biggest recommendation, make the move to put them in the IEP special ed of the world, because you can do kind of a lot more for students under that fact. With 504 plans, they're so deeply misunderstood that they get ignored quite a bit, unfortunately, just because in general they are deeply misunderstood. They're also far or much more rare to see. And so, if that comes, advocate for your student, know that their accommodations are also legally required, and support, and also keep an eye on them. All right, so how do we know that FAPE has been or is being provided? So a failure in providing any of the services that are, the word there is services, that are the student is entitled to per IDEA and per their IEP, their individualized education program. Failure to provide any of those services could result in a violation of FAPE. A violation of FAPE comes in two different ways, but I want you to know that both of those ways are completely eligible, or I don't know about eligible, are completely open for litigation, meaning lawsuits, meaning the tiniest sometimes thing could lead to a lawsuit. So those two types of violations come. The first one is called procedural violation. For example, these are missing timelines, like not doing paperwork on time, child fine, which we'll go over, but not identifying a student appropriately, or people not participating in their IEP meeting as they're required to or supposed to, or having documentation of some certain things. Those are more procedural things. Procedural could also be just not necessarily living up to the letter of the IEP that the student is required to have. So maybe like 12 different accommodations are listed, and that's quite a bit, but also only 2 of those are done with any kind of regularity and the others are missed. But if the others are supposed to be deemed to be helpful, this is a procedural violation, not fully following that to the law or to the letter of the law. And then we get substantive. Substantive violations are much more complex. They are, it says they're content of the IEP, but it's like very blatant content of the IEP not being followed. So not, well, I'll explain in a second. Then there's IEP implementation. So implementing any part of the IEP. And when they say that, they're generally referring to how much and many services the student is supposed to be receiving and whether or not they're actually receiving those. And the last is LRE, or least restrictive environment. And that is the placement of the student, where they are primarily being taught for the majority of the day. This is the big one, and one that's kind of been a big trend right now of ensuring that students are in their actual least restrictive environment, but that place also be appropriate to the student. So the reason I said that content of the IP gets a little bit weird in the accommodations example that I just gave. Say a student does have a list of 12 accommodations, but only a couple of them are being done with any regularity. That is far more a procedural violation just because some are being done and it could be remedied without the need of litigation. The only time where that will get kind of very messy is where the people who are supposed to be providing those accommodations or modifications are not doing that and refusing to do that. And that becomes a substantive denial of FAPE. A lot of procedural stuff. It was a big trend when you're looking at lawsuits over time in special education, a big trend for procedural violations to be the main source of FAPE claims or FAPE related claims, because for a long time, special education was so much more about having a place for students to go. So like a seat and a chair, and this is your chair and you're here, and great, you're getting special education. It had nothing to do about how well that education was being done, but more so like fighting for a right for that student to be able to come to school and be taught in school. Again, doesn't say it's good teaching or bad teaching, but like they have a right to be there. So many for a really long time of the litigation was just procedural, making sure that the basic things that the law says are going to be done are done. Now, the trend in special education lawsuits and litigation is very much substantive. And that's a whole other like history and law if you guys ever want that. But the substantive violations are a very significant denial of FAPE. And that word in that last one here is denial. A huge denial of FAPE, actually. So substantive would mean this is where we get into the part of what is appropriate education from the FAPE. Substantive means that it's not just anymore about a kid having a seat in the chair and legally having a right to be there and then also being there and having a teacher like dedicated to that person. It is so much more about what quality education looks like. And we could say this across the board for any student with or without a disability. If you look at just indicators of like what is good quality education, you'll just never see anything that says like, do they have a chair in the classroom? Because that is the basic expectation. Quality education should mean high quality instructors, evidence-based practices, having like the right setting and the right kind of teacher for all of these things. Substantive violations are really looking at not so much that we can make every single kid an A+ student, but that we give them the tools and the supports and we put them in place and we monitor them and we adjust as necessary to help them succeed. That's what a substantive quality of education currently is looking like. And this is not something that we can say universally is happening with students with disabilities. You could also argue it's not right now because of COVID happening with any kid, but this is the kind of trend we're seeing now in special education lawsuits. We got to really pay attention to what quality education means for students with disabilities. So in general, a good way to think about it, procedural violations can be corrected pretty quickly. Procedural violations, however, if not corrected, could lead very quickly into a substantive violation. And once we get into substantive violation, you have to fix it immediately because the consequence of the lawsuit is just not at all worth it. The minute you know that something is not right or wrong or unjust or like it gives you the icky feeling when it comes to students with disabilities and needs to be addressed, address it. You just have to trust me when I tell you that, address it. All right, that was FAPE. That was a big overview of FAPE. The word that goes in here is zero, for we're looking at zero reject. So as the name implies, zero reject means that no student identified with a disability can be denied FAPE. This also means that no student, if we're looking a little bit back, that no student who is suspected of having a disability can be denied the right to, or can be denied testing for that disability. It gets a little complicated when we're looking at like testing and who gives permission and who doesn't. But it also means that any student suspected of having a disability has the right to be tested for that disability as well. So they cannot be rejected just from the get-go. However, there are different place guards or different safeguards in place. So where does it get tricky when we're looking at zero reject? Students in rehabilitation facilities and rehabilitation, so that second word there is rehabilitation. Students in rehabilitation facilities include juvenile detention centers. It could include jail, depending on age. Includes medical facilities. Anywhere that is not the traditional school setting is probably a good way to put that. A very, very specialized setting. The reason it gets, well, I'm sorry, the reason it gets tricky for students in the specialized setting is that the law says that regardless of whether or not that student is in the school system, or regardless of whether or not that student is imprisoned or wherever they may be held or stationed, regardless if that student is homeless, regardless if that student is experiencing the world's most significant trauma, they cannot be denied their fate. It gets tricky. And also, as we look at the next ones, students requiring medical conditions that require hospitalization, we call these students home or hospital bound. Students with very, very severe disabilities, or even anybody who would be considered a severe disability. It gets tricky because education looks differently for these individuals. We have to look at it differently than we would look at education for students in your traditional gen ed setting, in your traditional neighborhood school. These students are generally taught in very different kinds of settings and require different considerations. Whatever those considerations may be, we as educators in general still have a public and legal responsibility to ensure that they are not denied their fate. It gets tricky because you may not have access to any of these students, or very little access to any of these students. And suddenly a name pops up and they're like, oh yeah, this is Michael. Michael's been in the hospital in and out for like 4 years because of significant health needs. There are systems in place to support students with the varied settings, but also we still have our responsibility, and that includes general education teachers, much less than special education teachers, if that student is on the general education curriculum track as well. It gets really complicated. Not complicated, you just have to individual case by case. For those of you that didn't know, juvenile detention centers, because they're serving the juvenile population, have a very high number of, or in my experience, I should say that, have a very high number of students with disabilities in their system. And just as an example, in Washington, D.C., where I was a teacher, the juvenile detention center had a whole team of teachers, because the students still require teaching with or without disabilities. All of them are requiring teaching if they're under the age of 18. And all of those students, not all of those students, so many of those students had IEPs, and all of them were eligible for FAPE, regardless of what their current schooling housing situation may be or was. Okay. There anything that comes up here under like a little blue, it gets a little hard to see. I'm just going to do it here so you can see. If you right click and go to hyperlink, it'll show you a little button to say open hyperlink. All of those will lead you to videos, additional resources if you want to watch them or use them. You are welcome to. Some of them are very helpful. I'll offer some additional explanations. I've lost my slide. There we go. Sorry. We're going to move on to child find. So the word here would be find. And what is child find? Well, I put here the section, if you look up IDEA, but also under the PowerPoint notes is a straight link to go see everything. I think it's just an interesting thing to see if you are ever interested in it. So IDEA requires that states must identify, locate, and evaluate. So those are the 3 words there: identify, locate, and evaluate any kids who need special education. Any kids. This is the state's responsibility. They also put it onto the public schools. And this whole process of finding students who qualify or who need special education is called child find. It is not simply enough for schools to only look at students who are attending their schools. They also have to look and seek out students who are in migrant families, who are homeless or without homes, who may attend school like 3 days a month. or like are technically on the roster but never came. This schools and the states by extension are responsible for finding kids who are homeschooled, are in private schools, or in charter school settings. Anybody who falls under within their like district bounds for the schools, uh, the schools is responsible for identifying them. So each state and its public schools must have policies and procedures. So these are the words, policies and procedures for finding these kids. In addition to that, they have to develop practical methods to identify which kids will qualify for special education services and their related services, and which kids are just maybe truant or require other kinds of support. And this is a big task, like a very big task. And we'll talk about some ways to do it, but I would love for you all to reflect on why the onus of identifying and seeking out and identifying students is placed on schools. I don't have a specific answer for you all, but I think there are great ways to have this conversation. And you can look at a big picture, you kind of look at a small picture. And along with that, you might find it incredibly helpful to ask your school what it is they do for child find. And because schools are required to have a system in place, you'd probably find it pretty quickly. Or within your district, you could probably Google within your district what your district says to do for child find. Those things I think are very interesting, especially if it pertains to you and what your practices are in your school. Here, I'm not going to go over this, but this is a link to an article on child find looking at, oh, actually, I do want to go over this. I'm sorry, it is on child find, but not on child find. Just to share with you all, but I do think the article is very much worth reading. So in Texas, the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, they set an arbitrary cap on special education services. And I'm smiling not because I think it was a good idea, it was a horrible idea, because the consequences of this are just ridiculous. So Texas decided that they are going to offer special education services to 8.5% of their student population. I'm sure it's a financial reason why they chose 8.5%. But as a comparison, in 2004, they had 11.5% of their student population across the entire state be eligible for special education services. They decided they were going to decrease that. Like the nature of education, you don't tend to decrease those problems unless you are not problems, the number of students, unless you have somehow managed to fix a lot of problems within education. This was working. This was a model that was working for them very well, I would say. I'll give you an example of something that they did. So instead of identifying a student with dyslexia as having a learning disability, which is legally what would be needed, Texas created dyslexia like learning support centers for the entire state and bought all this amazing software and these programs and these supports. And they were essentially providing everything, but not under the name special education. This only lasted for so long, but it was a model that was kind of like, look how great they're doing in addressing dyslexia. And they may have been doing wonderful addressing dyslexia. That's not quite the point, though. The point is that at some point, the federal government will be looking at all the practices, or your state government will be looking at your district practices, whomever. And they released a report that really, really put Texas on a map for a negative way when it comes to special education, because they showed that they were violating so many tenets of IDEA. And by extension, they were violating the FAPE of whatever the discrepancy of like 3% of kids are, which for a state as big as Texas is probably a huge number. And so when we're looking at just a dyslexia case, Texas was ordered to reassess and identify appropriately every single student that was previously denied special education services, but was identified for reading supports or under dyslexia, which meant that all the money they thought they had saved, they're probably doubling down on. because now they have to identify or assess so many kids, like so many kids, whether or not they actually have disability. Now they have to assess all these kids. They have to identify appropriately. They have to now provide all the services. And Texas also got a huge fine for not doing those things in the first place. But even more importantly, they owed all of those kids that they denied compensatory education, like additional money and supports. When you get a compensatory education slap from the school side, it just means you're paying money for whatever the student missed. They don't give those out very freely, so know that that was done pretty extensively. It was a huge kind of just like year in special education, really. Like you couldn't really go anywhere without hearing about like, oh my God, did you hear about Texas? Yeah. So that was one of the examples from Texas. There are a couple others because I think there was something else related to math. I think the article is very much worth reading. Very much worth reading. So another thing for you to think about, which well, I've already talked about it, the major provisions, the IDA that Texas violated here. Think about them. It's not exactly just vape. There's a couple of other things that we have already covered in the past like couple minutes, but have that have an effect here. And then what are other possible ramifications of this policy? So I already told you guys what the federal government did to or decided for Texas, or Texas had to kind of redo. There are, I think, social and moral ramifications that I don't know are discussed in the same way. And I think they're worth a conversation. Really good one to bring up one time. Okay, we're gonna move to, how do we fulfill our child find duties? So another acronym for you all, local education agency, or LEA, refers to your school. It's essentially the same thing as a school. On IEP forms, if you've seen them, you may see a line under like this, the team signatures page that says like LEA representative. That's who is the special education representative for your school. More often than not, it's a school administrator. You may have a dedicated special education administrator. That's usually the person. Teachers can also be LEA reps. Or rep designees, depending on the words you like. That's just important. It's schools. That's all it means. So if you were working for an LEA, local education agency, what are some actionable tasks you would do to fulfill your child find responsibility? So the word there is child find. Below, I put in some example strategies on the bottom right box of things that schools do. Door-to-door surveys, brochure mailings, public education programs like open house for the community type things, physician referrals. This is a really interesting one to me. If in the neighborhood you have a certain number of doctors, say there's like a medical complex in the neighborhood that the school is in, the school can say, hey, if you have any kids that you think, or the parents come in with having a disability, let them know that the child is entitled to services because of their disability, and you could refer them to the school and we can help them from here. This could, I think more often than not, you're likely to see this happen with school districts and physicians or hospitals and physician or medical providers, a little bit more than you would for schools, just because that's probably that's usually a process that's like a little bit more known. But it doesn't mean anything really, or it doesn't mean anything negative. A lot of times it's hospital systems will have like a social worker more on the side of education, not so much on the side of like, well, I mean, hospitals have a lot of different kinds of social workers. They'll have a social worker more on the side of education to ensure that if a student is diagnosed at any point, or a child comes in and has a diagnosis and say it's like a mental health need and they have to be in a different kind of facility for X amount of time, then there's a social worker specifically kind of designed, or not designed, but like put in place to support some of those education needs and ensure that there's communication between all those entities. Communicating across those like big government organizations or just organizations can be very difficult. So that's a big one. Contacting daycare providers, so important. And I don't know that a lot of places do this. I'm sure they do. I just don't know of it very much. Identifying youth or children with disabilities from the earliest time possible is so important. And so I think connecting with daycare providers is like a super smart thing to do, because if they're in daycare from 8 months on, or however much time the student has or the child has been in daycare, some of those markers are pretty well known to daycare providers. They have experience just generally understanding that there's maybe something a little bit delayed that might be needing attention, and they can help make referrals. And by referrals from these other outside organizations, it's more of like, hey, you should really talk to these people, and we'll let the school know, and they can help reach out to you. But that's kind of as far as their application goes. Private schools are the same, although private schools are not held to the same standard as public schools in meeting IDEA. They still have to meet some parts of IDEA. Likely they are in communication with the students, or their nearest public school system, to report any of these things, but or vice versa. There's still responsibility to ensure that the student is receiving education. Private school is a real interesting thing when it comes to special ed. It depends. It just depends. Okay, we're going to look at evaluation and identification. So the word there is identification of exceptional learners. Before we do that, I would love for you, or would ask you all to reflect on why is it why is it imperative schools have effective identification and evaluation procedures? Why can't we kind of just depend on figuring it out as we go? Why can't we just depend on parents reporting to us? Why can't we just depend on if paperwork comes in from a doctor? We'll take that, and that's all we do. Again, lots of different answers for this, but I would really like you all to reflect on these things before. Well, I don't know that I'm going to give you an answer. I think it's just important for you to reflect on it. Okay. So in evaluation and identification of exceptional learners, we have to talk about a couple different ways that are currently used to identify students with disabilities. The first one is called response to intervention. And some of you may be very familiar with this. It's kind of big in schools. Some schools, you'll hear about it. We'll look at it in a minute. And so response to intervention, or RTI, in the regulations of IDEA. So it's kind of like an amendment, but not full amendment to the law, kind of just like an addition regulations. The law contains two components that have increased the use of response to intervention frameworks in schools. The first component is providing more money. So up to 15%, so that's that line there, 15 of Part B funds. Part B refers to education of students school age, so 3 to 21 years old. I know there's a lot in this law. So up to 15% of the law that applies to school age children can be used for early intervening services. So that is when the law was written, that was not written specifically about response to intervention. It was written to say early intervening services. And sometimes that means people take that to states and funding people take those 15% to mean like early intervention services for little babies, little kids, not babies under the age of 3. Because again, like I said, providing those early intervention services is so incredibly important. And so 15% of those funds that are allotted to school age children could be used for that. 15% of those funds could also be used, or however they want to split that up, I guess, could be used to support school age children not responding to their current level of education. And then figuring out if they are not responding to those levels of education, then they might be eligible for special education. That is also considered an early intervening service. I'm not super sure how a lot of states split this 15% up. That is something, probably a good question to look at state budgets for. And if you didn't know this, you can look up the state budget for education for any state. You could look at it for your district, just Google it. They're all there. You could really see where your money is going. It's very interesting. Okay, so states were given permits to use the RTI frameworks to identify students with a specific learning disability instead of a discrepancy model. Do I have that here? I'm trying to remember if I have a discrepancy model here. Discrepancy models, or I'm going to add it there. wait to fail models, as they are kind of colloquially known, are it was kind of the old way of, or it's still very much in use, kind of the old way of identifying students with disabilities. You'd wait for them to fail. There would be a big discrepancy between their performance and the performance of their peers. And then you would say, well, all of my other students are roughly in the 5th through 6th grade reading range, and they're 7th grade beginning students. That kind of makes sense. We're good there, except and we did our, first semester has gone by, and most students have like a B or C average. They're generally doing fine given everything that's happening. But then we have John, and John is reading at a 2nd grade level, and he's getting an F, and he's in danger of failing the entire grade because he can't pass this course and probably other courses. That is, you know what, he might be eligible for special education. That is a model to identify students that has very much been used. Very much more pertaining to specific learning disabilities than any other, but not solely. And the reason it's a little bit more pertaining to specific learning disabilities because is that despite the name specific learning disabilities, it is a very general category. There are specific learning disabilities that are covered within the SLD category, specific learning disability. However, this category is also sometimes kind of a catch-all for students who we know for sure is not autism. We know for sure is not an intellectual disability. It's not ADHD. It's not emotional and behavior disorder, but they're not doing well. And then we don't know specifically what it is. We don't think it's dyslexia. We don't think it's dysgraphia. It's a learning disability. And that very much could be the case. It doesn't mean we have a name for absolutely everything. And I don't know that we need a name for absolutely everything. But that also means that this category, specific learning disability, if you use the discrepancy model as it's kind of weighted out, you only need a student to be at 2 or more grade levels behind. And if you think bigger picture, how many kids do you know in your teaching placements that are at least 2 grade levels behind? All of those students could technically be appropriate or identified, assessed, evaluated for having a disability. That is also an insane thing to think because we cannot test and feasibly think all of the students could have a disability. And that's not a great model. And so sometimes the idea was like, wait till they fail. That's not, nobody ever wrote it that way, but they called it discrepancy, but that's how it's just known. Wait till they fail. However, response to intervention comes around and provides a better solution to the wait to fail model. Sorry. Okay. Just answered that question, so we don't need that. Okay. The response to intervention works kind of simply, to be honest, as an idea. It's a little bit more complex in practice, but through collection of data, educators analyze students' change or lack of change to high quality research-based instruction. So this is actually a big one here, research-based instruction. For a couple of different ways per like the addendum to that law. The regulations dictate that states may determine whether a child has a specific learning disability by relying on a process that determines whether the child relies or responds to scientifically research-based intervention as part of the evaluation. At this point, you may have already heard the words evidence-based practice or EBPs, EBPs. And there's evidence-based practices for like nearly every facet of education. And within special education, there's EBPs for like all the different disability categories and placements and so many other kind of niche-y type places. But EBPs exist because research has been done, because studies are done to identify things that work for these group of students, X group of students. And they highly stress this scientific-based approach. And the scientific-based approach is a replacement to the wait till they fail and see what the big difference is approach. And I mean, generally a better one. When I'm going to show you down what this looks like. So you may have come across, depending on where you work, depending on your experiences so far, there are a couple of different response to intervention type models. they all very much look or do the similar type thing. So the first one is response to intervention. Response to intervention usually refers to academic only. So academic at the and they're like triangle shaped. So this triangle here on the left side is their tiers of intervention. Students will move within the tiers, and students would increase in tiers by level of supports needed. Students can also move down in the triangle, depending if they are improving, and maybe you can back off of some of those intensive interventions. So at the bottom tier, I'm sorry, here, both of these are links to extra videos if you want that. At the bottom tier is everybody. This is universal. 80 to 90% of students should like are in this tier one, and all of these students who are in tier one should have access to that high quality, evidence-based, research-based instruction. If any of you are working and using a direct instruction curriculum, you see them a lot more for little kids, like reading and math direct instructions. But direct instruction curriculum, huge evidence-based practice. Like it just works when it's done correctly and with fidelity and over again, proven to work kind of time and time again. However great you may think it is, it's just kind of scientifically proven, but that's also because money has been put into proving that. So yeah, look at it, whichever way you like. So say everybody is getting this great instruction. However, you have a number of students, it might not be a huge number, it could be like one or two number of students who are not performing in the expected range with that, even though they're getting high quality instruction that everybody else is getting. If that's the case, what you would do in an RTI model is document it, track it, figure out what's not working, and then add in another tier level of supports, another tier 2 students. You're giving them more targeted supports in addition to that great quality instruction. These do not mean that the student is receiving special education services. At this point, every single student is still in the general education world first. They haven't been identified as anything. All you've really done is say, hey, John needs some help. And he's not doing as well as like the rest of his peers. And it doesn't seem to be like a thing across the whole class. Like John himself is not doing well. Great, let's help John. And if John's not doing well because he has very specific dietary preferences and he doesn't eat lunch, and you see him after lunch and the kid has no energy, oh, that's a very easy targeted support to identify. Sometimes it could be something to do with their reading. It could be something to do with their output or their ability to process the information. Any level of additional supports that you put in place, you would put them, you would track them. You should also be meeting with like a school support team. We'll talk about that to make sure that you're kind of doing this with big approval so everybody knows where you are. And then as you put these interventions, these targeted supports or interventions in place, you are taking data the entire time to see if John's academic performance is improving given those accommodations or supports, whatever you want to call them. If the student is improving, great. You don't have to do anything. You can continue providing them those targeted supports and they can still function very well, and they're improving and they're going to be on par where they're supposed to be or expected to be. Wonderful. If the student is not improving, then we go into a tier 3. Tier 3 is much more intensive supports. Tier 3 is not quite bringing in your special educator for full testing just yet. It is bringing in that special educator into like the team to talk about it, to figure out what didn't work, to start getting that person's opinion or professional opinion perspectives on things. And the team as a team, so not solely the special or the teacher so much anymore, but the team is really working towards or finding a better solution to support our student John, because the bottom effective education didn't work, effective instruction didn't work, the second targeted supports didn't work. We are looking at intensive supports now. Intensive supports are not necessarily meant to last forever. However, if they're in use and almost like immediately wonderful, they could be. It does basically the same process happens at tier 3 that it does at tier 2. you are tracking all of that data. At this point, you are definitely bringing in families to talk as well. You are like being very intentional about what you're observing and recording and reporting. So many things there. And when your team kind of comes back together after like a predetermined set of time, usually like 4 weeks, I think 4 or 5 weeks, to see if any of those supports are working. And if they are, great, how do we make a plan to kind of lessen them, but also so that like the burden of providing these many supports is not filled every single day or every single minute of the time. And so maybe that they can learn to cope and function without the need of the excessive amount of support. It doesn't mean that you have to take them away, just kind of make a plan for that. And then great, they're still within their general environment. However, if the student at that point is still not responding, then the special education referral process can officially begin. And you can kind of, from the special ed side, if a teacher and the students team created and like worked and documented all of this and then brought it over to me as the official person to begin that process and that step, that testing and all that other stuff, and I had all of this data, you have made that process of identifying a student so much faster. There's still like very specific timelines we have to keep because of IDEA, but you have made that process so much easier, and you have really helped identify like this works and this doesn't work, but this doesn't work as well as it should. And from there, in that point, you and the special educator, whomever else is on that team, could really like put in all those additional services that are needed to make sure that student does get the benefit of education that they're supposed to get. That is essentially our tier 3. Sometimes you'll see it as a pyramid of 4 steps, but the same process applies. It's just one extra step. Usually in a 4-step model, the 4th tier is special education. It's fine. It just depends. Your team may have different kinds of rules specifically for like what to do in each tier and all this other stuff, or your school may have that. That's fine, as long as the general model of put things in place, observe, collect data, talk about it, put things in place. As long as that general model is in place, you are really making sure that you're not waiting for your student to fail. You are purposely looking for ways to help them succeed and identifying if any of those ways work. Sometimes they don't, and your student may still fail. That's not really the point to take away. The point is like you're actively working towards finding the right solution. Sometimes it might take a while. So on the right side of this page is PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. PBIS, sometimes you will see it as SWPBIS, School-Wide Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports. Same thing. I put the little circle there just so you can see the different parts, but they often conceptualize PBIS as the exact same triangle shape, 3 to 4 tiers. And it's looking at what does, either within a classroom or within the whole school environment, what does the school do for everybody? Sometimes you might know that to be like a token economy type system where the school gives like school bucks for kids, like, and kids earn them through good citizenship, and they can shop at the school store or have an extra recess or have like Fridays off or a homework pass or so many different things. And these are very, very specifically, our PBIS or school-wide PBIS is very specifically designed just for behavior, but same model behavior. Then we have MTSS, the multi-tier system of supports. Multi-tier system of supports is RTI and PBIS in one big triangle. Both sides of the triangle are essentially in use. They all, and I will also say this, they all come from the exact same world. MTSS just kind of combines them. It's not something that, it's not that we're not going to talk about it or focus, but I'm also, this is a whole class on its own, and I'm giving you the like quick and dirty version of things. This is just a different way to look at, to look at the triangle model, but the triangle tends to feel like stay pretty much the same. Whew, okay. It'll come back around as to why we need that for when I explain your assignment next. Universal screening. And again, this is a link to a video. Yes, that's a video. Universal screening is another way that we identify students with disabilities, administered at least once a year. So that first part is once. It could be fall, winter, spring. You also will see schools that do 3 times a year and literally will identify students multiple times a year or twice a year, but at least once a year is the minimum time to screen a student. Screening happens a couple different ways. The goal is to identify students who are likely at risk. So this is at risk for failure and need additional supports. So a couple different ways to screen, or just essentially 2 main ways. One is school-wide. So usually beginning of the school year tests. Sometimes they're like achievement tests. I think the one I had in mind was it comes up later. They're not usually supposed to be like very difficult tests. They're more like, are any red flags coming out of this test? And if so, we need to either further evaluate or further assess the student. Those are screeners. Screeners are used exactly for that purpose. The other one is anytime a new student or a transfer student comes into your school, they have to be screened as well. This is not usually like an arduous process. It's more just like, oh, hey, I need you to take this test. One of the teachers will give it to you. The kid gets pulled out of class really quickly to do it. They're not also typically very long tests. Again, they're just kind of tests to show if there's like a red flag that we should be paying attention to. And from there, we can make a decision. Question to ask is, if the tool that you're using, the test that you're using, is not consistent, which is also another way to say reliable for anybody who looks at the statistics world. So if that test is not consistent across students or accurately measuring what they want or they're supposed to be measuring, that is validity in the statistics world, what are some of those ramifications? Just a really easy one to think about is, or a good metaphor to use is like being a fisherman, a fisher person, and casting a wide net out into like a big expansive ocean where just well known to be to have a bunch of fish, right? Or great fish. You're looking for a very specific type of fish in this big old ocean, but you cast a huge net and you caught a bunch of fish. If this was my test and my test told me like 50% of the students that took it across the entire school have huge red flags, it's not necessarily, that might not be true, but that seems like a very high number. And so maybe this tool is not an effective tool. On the other side, the tool, like the test that we selected, the school selected for screeners, could be given to all the students, and it only gives me one student out of a school of 500 who has a possible learning need. That net is, as a fisherman, being cast too low or too small, and it's not as valid because it's not really measuring what I needed to measure. Because of 500 kids, you're going to tell me only one has in a public school has a learning need. Or out of school of 500, you're going to tell me 250 of them all have a huge learning need. Those numbers don't quite add up. In general, if you look at how many students with disabilities percentage wise across versus all other, it's like less than 10%. That's usually the number you kind of are looking for. So to keep that in mind. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less, but in that cushion range. Universal screening. Along with universal screening is progress monitoring. Again, that's a link. So progress monitoring, we know it in a couple different ways. As educators, we do progress monitoring with students all the time. We give them a test, or we're teaching a lesson on multiplication and or a multiplication of the number twos, because we did ones last time. We're on twos this time. And we are going to do a pre-test, and we're going to do all of these lessons. And then we're going to do a post-test. And then we're going to do another follow-up test. Next week, when we go over to threes, we'll do a refresher test. All of those things are progress monitoring. All of that classwork that you do with the students is progress monitoring, because you are able to monitor the students' progress in this thing that you're teaching. So they are administered just very regularly to all students, but you want to be very specific about how you look and interpret and also administer, like make sure you're consistently administering them to those targeted students. So any student who is at tier 2 plus, right? Formative assessments. So that's that second line here. The first one was regular. Formative assessments are, formative academic achievement tests are commonly used to do this kind of progress monitoring. It's very similar to that screener. They can be quick, easy to administer or score. You want them to have good just evidence behind them that this is a good progress monitoring type test to do. So an example of that is the Woodcock-Johnson. The Woodcock-Johnson, for those of you who are familiar, it's a big test that lots of different versions. The one that we use a lot in special education not only tells us like student progress, it can even begin to assess dyslexia. It gives an IQ score if you're going through the whole thing. It huge, very valid, very reliable, heavily studied, heavily used in education for a long time, and also in psychology. But they also have an achievement test, a short achievement test, like a screener, and it takes maybe like 20 minutes to do at most. That's a long time. This is one that is very commonly used as a screener, but also could be used as a progress monitoring type test. So if you are looking at just like graphing your students' progress monitoring, you're going to want like kind of line graph, and you're bulleting where the student is performing each time you give them this test. You're going to want to make like a trend line. What is this trend, the student's trend in their data? It doesn't even have to be like a crazy way to think about it. Is it progressing or is it not? Is it stable? Is it getting worse? What does it look like? And what does their expected growth rate look like? And there's a couple ways to look at growth rate too. That's a whole other thing we're going to do. Growth rate could be like a very specific measure. Sometimes that's like a state standard measure. Sometimes that's a class standard measure. Sometimes that's comparative across students in the grade. Just a little bit depends, but basically knowing where the student is and where they're supposed to be, and understanding or seeing if that data is telling you that a decision needs to be made as to whether or not the student is requiring more supports than they are being given. And if at some point those supports are excessive for the general education environment, then, or just for the one teacher to do on their own, I guess, then we're looking at the world of special education. But it all has to start from this whole process. So the same kind of question from before, if your progress monitoring tool is not consistent, what are the ramifications? So similar, but good to look at it both sides. It could show you that your student is improving at like massive rates. It could also show you that your student is not doing anything at any rate. And you don't really think that's quite true. That doesn't make sense. That you're like, we've worked on this for a long time. I know he knows his 2 times table. He's proving it to me, and in written and oral and lots of other things, but you have to make sure that the tools you're using for progress monitoring are effective as well. Formative tests are really good ones. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to just be very, very intentional about that data you collect and store and keep and have as like products. So assessments that could be used for this whole universal screening and progress monitoring process. It's good to generally select formal and informal measures for the purposes used. So things that have those like formative assessments that have like some reliability, validity behind them that we can kind of point to and say like, there's a reason we gave this test. But then also informal tests or classwork or products that tell a little bit more of the whole story. Informals are just as important as formals. I would never suggest relying on one over the other. So much more about your student can be told when we look at their writing, when we look at their like their actual work and things that they're producing inside the classroom. In addition to those formal tests, we need both of them. So the general consensus is to use multiple tests for determination. Multiple in this sense means more than one. We should never be able to see one test or one assessment measure to say that a student has a need. There definitely needs to be more than one. I would say 2 is probably too little, but more than 1 because of multiple. And they should be administered in the child's natural environment. So the setting that they're currently being taught in, you should give those tests in that setting. if you start changing that setting around, then like put your student in a whole other classroom and one-on-one take that test with that student. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but for the purposes of evaluating whether or not they are performing where you need them to perform, given those tiers that they're in, you do not want to mess with that environment or that setting too much. So say you have a student at tier 1, again, this is everybody's level of instruction. You shouldn't be pulling them aside to take a test on their own unless everybody's doing that. Take that test in their natural environment with the supports that they are entitled to at that time. If you have a tier 2 student who is receiving some supports, and say one of those supports is in testing, then go ahead and give them that test given those supports at their level tier 2. The same thing for tier 3, and the same thing for a student who's receiving special education services. We do not provide, in general, educators do not provide accommodations or modifications for testing for students without disabilities or without being on one of these tiers that is completely required. So the last piece of the assessment piece is that you should have somebody who is qualified to administer the assessment, but also interpret those results, or have somebody come in and help interpret those results. For progress monitoring purposes, this can just be your educator, yourself as a general educator. For tier 3 plus, this is definitely the special educator that you want to bring in, or the school psychologist that you want to bring in. You're going to want more than one set of eyes on things first, for sure. Okay, we're almost there. This is just a summary of these 4 areas that we've kind of looked over. And then your question may be, and I know I've kind of looked at this before, brought it in a couple of times. Where do you come in? Where do I come in? As a general education teacher, you would come in under the student support team, or SST. Again, your school, some words are universal, some are not. Your school may have a very specific name for this kind of team. Your school may give you like a cool name. That's a tiger support team. I don't, it's fine. But know that if the purpose of that team that you are now a part of, that like they're forcing you to be a part of and nobody ever explained to you, is to provide or to work within a professional group that understands your school and its needs and the students, to identify students who are at risk, who the purpose of this team is to work collaboratively to support those students. So tier 2 plus, this team is working, they should be working together, should be meeting, should be discussing before we put any interventions in place, before we discuss which students we're going to pay attention to right now, before we look at which students might be something we need to keep an eye on. As a team, you are also likely to go through all of the student assessment scores, either big state or district tests that they had to do, or their screeners. You are looking at a lot of different things. And not every single general educator is put into these SST teams. I think you really should be. You might be pulled in for specific students. Sometimes it just kind of depends on who's on which team. In general, you're going to have school administrators, you're going to have some gen ed teachers, you're going to have, sometimes you will have a special educator, sometimes you won't. They will, depending on schools, they may wait until kind of the end of that process to bring in a special educator. That sometimes they'll have them from the beginning. Kind of a little bit depends. That's a little bit more on staffing than not. So again, just looking at your tiers, tier 1, high quality instruction, didn't work. We move our student to tier 2. Before we move our student to tier 2, that SS team is meeting, is talking, and is saying, I have a student named John, not doing so great. I checked in with some of the teachers, not really doing great in the things too. Here are their grades. Here are some of their examples. I think we should move them to tier 2. The whole team agrees. You guys create a tier 2 plan. That's when you guys have officially technically stepped in. At that point in that tier 2, again, we were providing interventions. We were taking data. We were being very intentional. We were reporting and providing updates and monitoring that student's progress with the team. For sure. At this point, you may also want to bring in the family. I don't think that at tier 2 you have to, but you might want to, for sure. If your student is at risk and the school is doing stuff, shouldn't you communicate that with family? Yes, that's the answer. Your school may very well at all points of this be communicating with families. That's just me saying. Again, tier 3, student support team still coming in. If tier 2 doesn't work and tier 3 kind of moves into place, I'm sorry, that was up. Tier 3, more intensive. That is like more intensive. There we go. Tier 3, when tier 2 doesn't work, provide more intensive. You're doing the same thing with your team. You're doing all of that work. And when none of that works, then we move on to the official special education referral process. And that is a whole different kind of process that happens. Happens a lot less with general education teacher input. Or like work, that this is now the work of the special educator or special education team, because this process is very procedural. There's a lot of steps and timelines we have to meet and specific ways to write and document. And we don't, depending on the student's needs, we don't do all the testing. Sometimes the testing has to come from an outside source or a different person within the school building. And so this process gets a little bit more complicated, but this is from the gen ed side, how to start working on having students identified as having a disability. That was a long process. Okay, before I close out, I want to go over your upcoming assignments. If I could just pull them up here. So first thing we're going to look at is the written field reflection number 4. As I mentioned, it's changed just a little bit from, sorry, one second. It has changed just a little bit from what the syllabus has said. So instead of having you read a very long article, I am asking you all to, I'm going to show you 2 ways to look at this. I know some of you already know. If you're on modules or our homepage, we are in week 5. We were in week 5. You'll see reflection number 4 down here. If you go to assignments, you can find reflections as well. You can also find them under discussions. You have 3 ways to look for them. Reflection number 4, week 5. So for this week, I am asking for responses of 250 words. Again, this is the same parameters from the last couple discussion boards. What I am asking you to do is to complete this IRIS module. The link is here on the pre-referral process. So basically this process that we've talked about. Okay, when you click that button on the IRIS modules, it takes you to the module page. The pre-referral process for students with academic and behavioral concerns. So basically what we've talked about, you can also, once you complete this, do a professional development certificate, which I think is wonderful. You can add that kind of stuff to your resume. I'm happy to help you all. Once you go through it, it's going to have you start off with a video. There's a transcript there. It's going to have you do some work. And as you go through, you'll see that there's a couple different pages. And with each page, you're just kind of scrolling down, reading through and looking at to see all of their steps and processes. And when you are done going through all of those pages in your module, this is the wrap up. We don't want the wrap up. You do want the wrap up. The very last page of this module is the assessment page. I am asking you to begin here, looking at questions 4, 5, and 6, right there. It is based on one of the case studies they use for What About Walker. It starts on page 4 of this module. And then you're going to answer the questions 4, 5, and 6 in your post. And I am very much looking forward to your responses. All right, so that is our first to-do list item. Our second one is identifying appropriate interventions, the SST forms, part 1, and also discuss part 2. And then before I wrap that up, the lesson plan 1, I know many of you have already submitted your lesson plans. I'm working on giving you feedback, and you will have feedback by the end of this week. And your lesson plan part 2 is to do those revisions that I put up there, respond to those feedback essentially. So let's go back to show you what the SST form assignment looks like. That's the wrong one. Okay. Again, under assignments in our class, you can find SST forms right here. And I know my Canvas looks a little bit different than yours. Okay, so general information, just the objective. Here are all the details about this assignment. It comes in 7 steps to complete this. So the first step, I want you all to pick a student from your teaching placement who is struggling or at risk that you did, like you just see from your observations. It's a student who is displaying concerning academic and behavior challenges, either one or both, and who would benefit, in your opinion, from targeted supports. So this could be a student that you have worked with, that you are currently working with. That's either one is totally fine. I want you to first write a brief summary about your student. Tell me everything I basically need to know about this kid. I always include this because I think it's important. Who is this person, this child, as a human being? Because they are first a person. And I think we tend to forget that because they're little and then we're in charge of them and they're yelling at us or whatever. We tend to forget that they're a person. So put them as a human being first. Tell me who they are. What's their background? What do they like? What do you know about them? Them as a person. Then what do you know about them as learners, which is very important. What are you seeing? How are they functioning? How are they performing? What is going on with them as learners? Are they progressing? They're kind of just skating by. You're not really sure what is happening here. And I want you to tell me what concerns you. Like, why did you pick this kid of all the kids you could have picked? That is a big one. Or yeah, tell me what we're looking at here. Sorry. So in 1 to 2 paragraphs, give me this. I don't have any specific formatting for this. I just kind of want to know what I need to know about this student. And then you're going to complete 3 different forms. So 1, 2, and 3. The first form is asking you, sorry. The first form is, yes. Sorry, is essentially a very brief initial referral form. It comes in Form A and B. You're going to need to do both. Very brief. SST forms are usually much more complicated than this, but kind of given our alternative scenario, I think this is a little bit more structured for us. So I want you first, never give me their real names, make up a fake name. Don't give me their real birthdays or their family's real days. Just, you can make up that information. That's fine. I don't also need your phone number. I just kind of kept this, kept this information here. Reason for referral, very important for me to understand. Give me some strengths. How do you know that this is a strength? What are some additional comments that would be helpful to know this information? Same thing for weaknesses, evidence. How do you know that this is an area of need or weakness? And then you're going to go to Form B, second page. And you are going to check all that apply for things that you observe with the student in any of these areas. And there is like a behavior, attention stuff down here. Only check off the ones that you are observing and that are actually coming up as areas of concern. So even if you didn't know what the areas of concern like specifically were called when you picked the student, make sure you kind of go through this list and see if any of these apply. All right, that is Form 1. Form 2, think about why the student, for Form 1, think about why the student needs to be referred for intervention supports. The answer, it just cannot simply be like, he's loud, he's never in a seat, he's the worst. That's not how we identify kids. That's just kids being kids sometimes. So you definitely gonna want to make sure you have that set. Then we have part 2, or the second form, is the academic interventions list. So what you're going to be doing here is identifying if any of these interventions have been put in place for the student already. Based off what you know, you can ask the teacher, let them know that this is not, the student's never, this is not ever going to impact any specific kid. This is you kind of just completing an assignment. That's fine. If none of them have been done, you can put no efforts made if it's not applicable to like the area of need that you told me for the student, or if it's another one that's not listed here. So I have instructional, specific to reading. Yeah, reading, language arts, reading, math, another one in math, writing, oral expression. This is a good one to ask. So if the child is from a diverse background, what efforts are typically made to help their culturally responsive instruction? This could be very important for students, especially those who are coming from a second language or recently new to the country, or have a very strong culture that they identify and like respond to, or are responsive for. These are important questions to ask. If you keep scrolling down, they're just separated by page. There's one on just behavior. There's one on environmental factors that sometimes are important to know. This at the very last page is just a glossary of terms for some of those different terms that are in the checklist. If you didn't know them, you can also Google anything that comes up, but I left them there for you all. So that is form 2. You're going to fill that out for the student for any student level interventions that have already been put in place. And then finally for form 3, you're going to look at classroom level interventions that have been put in place. And the classroom level things, once it comes up, are essentially the same thing. I'm actually going to fix this in just 1 minute to say check off, not date tried. You don't have to put date tried. Sorry. So this one is the same thing. It have these already been done in the classroom to support the student. You might find that some are exactly similar, like environment, but go ahead and do it again. Assignments, adaptations, organizational skills, instruction, behavior. Normally you would want, if you already tried it, the date you tried and the data that goes along with it. A lot of these SST forms in real life ask you for mountains of data for absolutely anything you check off. I am currently just asking you to check off things because I don't think we need to look at mountains of data to understand the process. So for this part 1 of the assignment, you are going to turn in your brief summary, forms 1, 2, and 3. For the most part, this is like these are 25 points for this part 1. If you do them, you're going to get all 25 points. I have no way to tell you if you're right or wrong. More so that I want you to think about this individual student, what's been put in place, what's about them that needs to be addressed, what that's essentially what gets turned in for part 1. For part 2, this is why there's a 7th step here. I'm preparing you for part 2. So over the next 2 weeks, I want you to keep an eye on your students' progress with their current levels of support. I'm not asking you to put in any additional levels of support, though you can if none have been done already. So let's say you have identified a student, your student Belkis, and she's not performing as well as you expect her to, and something doesn't quite seem right. And you went through those checklists and you can't really say that anything's been done for your student Belkis, not specifically. That's fine. Looking at that list, I'm going to guess that you're going to be able to identify a couple of things that you might want to put in place. Pick like 1 or 2 of them and put that in place. I wouldn't do more than that because then you're like it kind of scatters how well you know that one thing works at a time. Even if you have a student who maybe does already have some of those interventions in place and you really, really want to put at least one new one in place with them and just like to help them, that's fine. You are definitely welcome to do that. Make sure that you have your school's permission. I don't know why they would say that you're not allowed to help somebody, but that's not the point. So over these next 2 weeks, the ones that come up, I want you to just keep an eye on that student's progress. Take any notes that may seem pertinent to you, kind of just a little like thought you write down later, something you jot down really quick. Of any supports that you see that are helping or not helping that student, that are being used or not used at all. That's just like valuable information. It's going to come in handy for the second part of our assignment. And I'm just going to take you to the second part so that you can see what that looks like. If we go back, the second part of our assignment is review what you did for the verse, and you're going to complete form 4, which I realized I did not link there. Form 4, I will link it in just a bit, is looking at reevaluating what was in place and determining if you need to change it and why. And the why is the very important part. Like, why would you change that? Why would you make that adjustment? What's the reason for that? So you're going to complete that form based off the student that you chose. And in part 2, I also want you to write a second brief reflection. So a little bit more of a reflection, not so much a summary of your experience going through this process and evaluating your students, and also seeing how many different interventions there are and that we may not know of. And like some may be really great for our students. I have some questions here for you all to follow. And much like the summary in the first one, I don't have any specific formatting for you to follow. I want to see what you got out of this or see what questions you may have at the end. And then two to three paragraphs work. So for this final part of the assignment, you're going to turn in form 4, which again, I'll link in just a bit, and your written reflection. That is that assignment. All right, everybody. So that is all I have for you all. I know this was a pretty long lecture, actually. Feel free to split this up. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer anything I can. And then have a great week.